Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion on the military technology implications of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. My name is Leah Walker, and I am an associate at the Institute for Security and Technology, which is a Bay Area think tank dedicated to solving critical international security challenges through better security and technology. I'm joined by a wonderful panel of guests for this event. I'm very excited to introduce you to them. We are joined by Sam Bendett, who is a research analyst with the Center for Naval Analyses, where he is well known for his work on Russian military technology and unmanned systems. We also have Dr. Ulrike Franke, who is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where she is known as an expert on drones and emerging technologies. We also have Whitney McNamara, who is an electromagnetic spectrum and emerging technologies policy subject matter expert. And lastly, we have the wonderful Bob Bateman, who is a writer, historian, and a former US Army strategist who recently authored a foreign policy article titled "No, Drones Have Not Made Tanks Obsolete," which I highly encourage everyone to go check out. On a brief note before we start, I do want to mention that while this conversation will be focused on military and technology matters, we will be discussing a real conflict that is happening in real time that has significant escalatory risks. There are real people on the ground whose lives are being seriously impacted by all of this, and that's something that we should not forget. And with that, I am happy to open up the discussion. And I just want to start with a quick question to all the panelists, which is, what is the thing that you have been following the most? What is your big point of interest in this conflict? What has been the thing that has struck you the most throughout this time? And I would love to start with Sam for that.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm glad to be part of such a distinguished panel. I definitely look forward to all the discussions. For this conflict, I'm following how Azerbaijan is utilizing a very wide range of drone models in this conflict. I'm also following how Armenia is trying to position its air defenses. But probably one of the most important elements here is that despite all the successes and all the public relations, if you will, that was given to the drones, it is really the infantry and the ground forces that still take territory. So if there is, objectively speaking, a success or a failure in the conflict, it would be accomplished and enforced or lost by the infantry, aided by new technologies like drones.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Ulrike?
Sam, as a 25-year infantryman, yes.
Wonderful. And Ulrike, what is your takeaway from all of this?
Yes, hello. Hello from London. Good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Thanks a lot for having me. Very similar to what Sam said. So I'm also looking predominantly at the use of drones in this conflict. And I think what struck me most so far is their importance in this conflict to begin with. Drones have been on the battlefields for many years now, but in this conflict between two, smaller armed forces with limited airborne resources, we can really see how important unmanned systems have become simply because of their availability, because they're cheaper than manned systems. And so I've been following how they have been used, the difficulties of countering them. I'm sure that that's something we want to discuss as well. And maybe to add to what Sam said, another element of drone use that I find really quite striking in this conflict is their use for propaganda purposes, right? This element of whenever you use a drone, you basically have a camera team with you. And the Azerbaijani side in particular has just made great propaganda use of the clips they have been filming while carrying out attacks or while doing ISR. And I think that's also worth noting.
Absolutely. And I think those are very important points, and we will be touching on pretty much all of those during this discussion. Whitney, I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Leah. One thing I keep coming back to as I've been reading about this conflict is it might be easy to say because Armenia and Azerbaijan don't have, notably professional or sophisticated militaries, that the drone challenges that they're facing is one that advanced militaries wouldn't have to contend with or wouldn't struggle with. And I think, as Ulrike was saying, there's a reason we see a proliferation of UASs used by militaries and non-state actors. They can be enormously effective and an affordable way at undermining a more technologically advanced military. And we've seen UAVs and electronic warfare used the past few years in Syria, Ukraine, Libya, and now in this conflict. But I would argue that these are fairly simple electronic warfare systems and techniques that we're seeing, and they're used to great effect largely because the targets that they are targeting are soft and unprotected. So in that way, that's the good news, right? I don't find these tactics or systems to be particularly impressive because of the type of assets they're going after. The bad news is I don't actually know how much better more sophisticated forces would fare against the same systems and tactics. And that's largely because Western forces simply haven't faced these types of techniques in real conflict. And I would argue that we don't train enough for these types of situations. So we don't actually know that the Western militaries would fare much better. So I'd be careful to dismiss the lessons from this conflict as not applicable to the West.
Thank you, Whitney. And I think that's a very interesting point. And I will want to return later to what sorts of implications this has for Western militaries. Bob, we now turn to you. I would love to hear what your thoughts are and what has struck you the most during this conflict.
Well, taking up my role as not just as an Army officer, but as a professor of military history, we've seen the idea that new technologies trump everything. Oh God, I hate using that word. Trump everything, and then realizing that no, they don't. Whether it has been barbed wire or the machine gun or all sorts of different things, there's always a countermeasure, and it reaches back, as I wrote in my article, at least the 1300s, with the Eigenos and the Landsknecht, demonstrating that mounted knights, they weren't all that. Not faced with a technology that was already 1,500 years old, disciplined infantry. So tactics and training also matter when you're talking about technology. When I was thinking about what branch I wanted to become as an Army officer, and mulling basically between infantry and armor, the frenzy at that time in the late 1980s was brilliant anti-tank munitions. The idea that there were mortar rounds that you could fire, and from relatively small mortar tubes that could reach down and hit, most of them were acoustic, hit armored vehicles. And a single light infantry, not even armored infantry, not even a tank unit could destroy whole shreds, whole battalions and regiments of armor. Was what we saw as the future. And I fell for it, and I went infantry because I wanted to be able to dig into the dirt when things got real. But that didn't turn out to work. And drones have significant flaws. Not flaws, but it's going to be another issue of point counterpoint. The thing is that countering drones, because they're cheap, is also relatively cheap. That's my point.
Whitney, I would love to have you answer that. So when it comes to the difficulties of countering drones, do you think it is something that is particularly easy, or do you think it's something that's the real question here is we have both sides on this conflict using a significant amount of drones, particularly on the Azeri side. Are they fielding significant anti-drone technologies? Is there a different sort of learning curve to getting those anti-drone technologies that they may not have yet?
So I think sometimes counter UAS systems can kind of get lumped into one category when they actually should be taking on multiple mission sets. Whether your drone is carrying, you know, a GPS, a kinetic weapon, is it used for surveillance, the size of the drone, the speed of the drone, how long that drone can fly above you without losing its endurance. So there's a lot to take into consideration. And I know European industry struggles with this as well because they're trying to develop a counter UAS system that can contend with many mission sets. And I think that is very difficult to do. You know, many different counter UAS systems are meant for different situations. And do you want to, jam the GPS of the UAV? Well, if it has a kinetic payload, where is that going to land? Is that going to still land near your forces? Do you want to use electronic warfare, high-powered microwaves? Maybe you don't want the destruction of the drone to be found because you don't want the enemy to know that you're being tracked. If you're in a remote area, directed energy can give you unlimited payloads, but you better hope the weather is good. So different situations call for different responses. Should your system be focused on high-value targets or multiple low-value targets? Will you manually target, or do you want some sort of AI or ML to help classify and prioritize targets? So sometimes we talk about, counter drone, but we're actually talking about many, many different mission sets, and some of which can be quite expensive to procure. And of course, then to pile on, if you want a very comprehensive or dynamic coverage, how do you then integrate all these systems into your wider air defense networks? So of course, I do think there's not a sophisticated use of counter UAS in the conflict now. But I would say that it is a very complicated issue. I mean, even one that Western militaries are confronting right now.
Thank you. Absolutely. And I'd like to turn to Enrique, and I would love for you to talk about how effective drones have been and whether you think that there has been, because it seems to me, and obviously I'm not an expert in these things as all of you are, but it seems to me that the drones on both sides have been relatively uninterrupted. There have been significant drone shooting down, but not in the way that you would expect given just the massive amounts of aerial firepower that we're seeing coming from unmanned systems. So I'd be very interested in hearing your perspective on whether these drones have been used to their most efficient potential and what sort of limitations there have been.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, I want to very much second what Whitney just said, because I think she very much made the right point here, that in the same way that drones, like the term drones means so many different things, you also need counter-drone systems that reflect that. And there's a reason why there are so many different approaches to counter-drone systems. First, how you do it, electronic, kinetic, etc. And you were mentioning Western militaries. I mean, the US military, I think until recently, they had like 48 different counter-drone systems. They tried to cut it down to, I think, 7 or 8, but you still need a full range. And for some drones, for the smaller ones, the kind of shooting them down with a shotgun may actually be, a useful way of countering them. And I just saw reports of I think the Swedish military that is using smart targeting systems made by the Israelis to kind of add to their, standard rifles so that they can use it to counter some drone systems. Of course, you're not shooting down a predator with a shotgun bat or with an army rifle, but there's definitely this full range. And then there's also the question of, do things need to be portable? Do you need them everywhere, or do you need them placed at one specific point? So I think that really is the challenge. And this is not just a challenge for militaries with less capabilities. In terms of how effective drones have been in this conflict, I mean, first of all, I think we need to caveat this whole discussion by saying that it is very difficult to say anything on the effectiveness of the systems on the ground while being far away and just observing the reporting from there. So I think that's important to note. I think what has been very important in this conflict, from what I've been seeing from the reporting, is the fact that you can really use drones throughout the full depth of the battle space, right? So we are seeing lots of losses kind of behind the front line, which of course isn't completely new. This was always the appeal of aerial warfare, right? And let's not pretend that we haven't seen aerial warfare before. But now we're kind of moving further and further into the depth of the battlefield, because of course you can use drones you can take more risks with drones. You can send them into enemy territory where you risk them then being shot down, but you don't lose as much as you would with a manned system. And so I think that's one thing that's worth noting in that context.
Absolutely, thank you. And while we're on the topic of the many varieties of drones in general and being used in this conflict, I'd like to turn to Sam to see if you could give us some insights on the different type of drones being used. There's fairly good evidence that Turkish TB2s are being used, as well as several different Israeli models of drones. And I would love to get your perspective on how each of those different drones are being used and which ones are proving to be particularly effective.
So I'd like to second Ulrike's comment that we can now penetrate the enemy's entire depth when we're talking about adversarial action. And so Azerbaijan has rearmed itself over the past decade with a very significant lineup of drones. It has acquired Israeli long-range Harpy loitering munitions. It has acquired Striker loitering munition drone from Israel. It has acquired multiple orbiter models, also from Israel, which also function as either a loitering munition or as an ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drone. It is using long-range Hermes and other Israeli models. The stars, if you will, of this morbid show has been the Bayraktar, which is a Turkish unmanned combat aerial vehicle. It has been used sparingly. There's evidence, possible evidence, that it is the Turks themselves that are actually manning and using these drones on the Azeri territory. There's also evidence that has emerged that Turkey sold cargo loitering quadricopter to Azeri forces as well. So what Azerbaijan has is an ability to either observe its adversary at a few kilometers to a few tenths of kilometers, potentially up to 100 kilometers out, and to strike that adversary within either a close range or actually mid to long range. And this is rather unprecedented. Now, we have to ask why Armenia, which has been locked in a conflict with Azerbaijan and a frozen conflict at that, hasn't really tried to match Azerbaijani capabilities when so many of these acquisitions were public. They were public releases, they were public statements. So we have to kind of think through some of the risk management and decision-making as well that is involved in this conflict. When two small nations are side by side and one nation is starting to acquire a lot of capable UAVs from other friendly nations, what is the decision-making for the country against which such technology is going to be used? I would like to take this very quick opportunity. I have a couple of slides that I want to show, if that's all right. I'm going to share my screen. And what we, hold a second. Okay. We're hearing a lot of comments about lots of vehicles and tanks lost in a conflict. So this is an image of several Armenian tanks, I believe, that have been knocked out by Azeri drones. What we can see here is that these are older T-72 models. They don't have a lot of protection on them. In other words, many recent tank models produced by Russia, produced by United States, Europe, China, Israel, and many other nations feature a variety of protection against different types of weapons. And so this is an example of a Russian lineup. From left to right, we have the T-72, the T-80, the T-90, the Armada main battle tanks, and then the Armada base armored vehicle. And what you can actually observe is going from left to right, from the slightly older to the most updated models, is the level of protection that are offered for these tanks. These little squares, these little rectangles, for those who don't know, are different types of explosive reactive armor. In other words, while most tanks have been built to withstand hits and adversarial action from the front and from the side, more and more modern vehicles are now getting significant protection from above as well. This is an image of a Russian T-72 main battle tank on exercises in the Baltic Fleet. So you can see that it has been camouflaged, first of all. Second of all, you can see those protective mechanisms on the turret. In other words, this tank has been now designed to withstand both observation and kinetic activity from the ground as well as from the air. And then going forward, I would like to point out that these are the armored vehicles where such protection will be built into the vehicle proper. So all these kind of straight lines on the two vehicles shown, on the Russian vehicle on the right and the Israeli vehicle on the left, this is very extensive protection against all kinds of weapons, including weapons from above. So yes, Azerbaijani drones have been very effective, but they've also been very effective against older vehicles that didn't really have a lot of protection. So the question is, how would such UAV lineup fare against a tank force, an armored vehicle force that is much better protected?
Thank you so much, Sam. That actually plays perfectly into my next question, which I would like to pose to Bob. You talk a lot in your foreign policy article about how the tanks that are being used in this conflict are not necessarily the most modern tanks, and that they probably aren't being manned by the most well-trained armies. So I'd like to get your input, Bob, on what you think is behind some of this lackluster tank performance.
Well, yes, technology does matter, and technology moves things along. But I'm gonna take this on two sides: the UAV side and the tank side, or the armored vehicle side, to give it a broader application. Oh, Sam, by the way, I want to compliment you on that. I'm going to steal this phrase. This morbid show was a great phraseology. I love that. But here's the thing. Defense is almost always more expensive than attack. So you can up armor and up armor and up armor to the nth degree. But adding layers of armor really hasn't worked over the millennia. No, in 1494, when Francis VIII went charging through northern Italy, yeah, historian, right? He knocked down a whole, oh, I was going to use a swear word, sorry. He knocked down a whole lot of castles using this new technology of cannons, because he was facing stiff, high, thin-walled castles. And his relatively new cannon could knock those down in a couple of days versus months of siege work. Building castles that could resist cannon was massively expensive. Much the same applies to any defensive idea. So I think that and while I respect Sam's points about the developments of in armor, I mean, reactive armor is, yeah, really cool, but the top armor of a tank is always, and all armored vehicles, the tanks are usually given reactive armor, but most other armored vehicles are not the personnel carriers, not the, and it is not viable against kinetic weapons coming from the sky. However, again, there's point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. So the idea of counteracting the UAVs themselves, not their munitions. Now, I would say that, you know, harking back to an earlier question, the Azerbaijanis have been using to great effect relatively cheap munitions, but they've been using it in an environment where they were not facing a threat against their own UAVs. Not a significant threat. They've lost a couple, but and they're fighting an unsophisticated foe that does not have either ground-based or air-based countermeasures against the UAVs they're flying. And they're not exactly flying stealthy UAVs. So, yeah, I don't think that this question is solved, but I think that UAVs are just a hiccup, in my opinion. They are too easy to counter.
Thank you. I would love to hear Ulrike's point on this.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that, because I think we were talking about effectiveness earlier, and I think we all agree that, you know, UAVs have been proven to be quite effective at the moment in this conflict. However, I think we need to emphasize that it is in this particular phase of the conflict that UAVs have played an important role. And I mean, we all hope that this war, this conflict doesn't develop further, but it may. And it is very likely that we are going to talk about, you know, more classical, you know, invasion and occupation of territory, and then UAVs may play a much lesser role. And I think it's just kind of worth mentioning that at this point, especially with the kind of people I work with, we're very much framing this as a kind of drone war, which to some extent it is at the moment, but it may not stay that way. And I think it's important to remember that this is an ongoing conflict, and there are only so many things that you can do with a drone. This is something I have kept repeating for the last few years, because a lot of people seem to think, oh, now that we have drones, we can like wage wars without having to send anyone. And I always say, I mean, yeah, at the beginning, but if you want to occupy territory, if you want to invade a country, like, you can't do this with drones. And if this is where this conflict is headed, and again, hopefully it won't come to that, but if this is where the conflict is headed, then we may see a change in the importance of drones, and maybe then they will be just used for propaganda again, or something like that. So it's worth emphasizing that.
I'd also just like to respond to what Bob said, because I do think that even if we are able to shoot down drones, right, we get all the right technology, we get all the right systems, we integrate them. Even if you're still able to shoot them down, drones still are posing a challenge to you. It's taking time and resources away from being able to advance and make progress in achieving whatever your military objectives are. I think the US is still very focused on attrition-based warfare, forgetting that sometimes total destruction doesn't always have to be pursued, right? If to achieve your goals, if you're, disrupting, dislaying, harassing your enemy, that can be very sufficient to achieve whatever your military objectives are. So even if we have the most exquisite counter-UAS technology, drones are still going to be imposing time and resources on us as well. So, and we don't want to be stuck in that kind of move, counter move cycle either. We want to be able to move outside of it so we can achieve our broader military objectives. So that is something to keep in mind when we're talking about that sort of competition or dynamic.
Can I step in?
Absolutely.
Okay, so two things. But Whitney, more to the point is that it is a cost-benefit analysis at all times. Why I made the reference to Charles VIII invading Italy was because it was so much cheaper for him to knock down castles than it was to build new castles. You know, he changed the equation. And so in this case, drones have, at this level, not among primary state combatants. We haven't seen primary state combat, thankfully. But the idea is that, you know, drones are really cheap against an incompetent or unequipped foe, and that's great. But when we're talking about higher level combat among near peer competitors at a higher level, anti-drone technology will be cheaper as well. That's where the technology seems to be going. It'll be easier to knock down the drones that can kill a tank. A tank is pretty expensive. A drone is relatively inexpensive. An anti-drone drone is even less expensive. And so, just like Francis or Charles VIII was dealing with, you lower your cost to knock down your opponent, and that makes you the winner.
I'd like to chime in, if I may.
Absolutely, please.
So to the north of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is Russia, which is watching this conflict very intensely. Some of the Russian commentators have described the counter-UAS defenses as essentially as a must going forward, as a must for future war. And Russia's own, for example, experience with dealing with drones, arguably not the sophisticated ones used by Azerbaijan, but even less so the DIY drones that struck Russian bases in Syria, they were countered by what the Russians called the echelon defense, or early warning radars combined with electronic warfare systems, combined with anti-aircraft systems. So this type of defense, the echelon defense, the three-layer defense, if you will, is a requirement going forward because drones are going to be absolutely ubiquitous and common across all battle space and all conflicts. Also, tanks and armored vehicles don't just fight on their own. Obviously, they're more effective as a combined armed force. And such force has its own air defenses, has its own electronic warfare, and going forward, counter-UAS complements. So if we are sort of looking for the lessons from this war, going forward, every competent military force is looking at the Azerbaijani relative success at this point in time as a reflection of some of the inadequate defenses on the Armenian side. For sophisticated adversaries like the Russians, like the Chinese, the combined arms formations where tanks and armored vehicles are matched with other systems are going to become basically very common going forward. So I know that the slide that I showed, slides that I showed indicated tank defenses. It is also very difficult to knock out a tank with a loitering munition that Azerbaijan uses as well. A tank that is well defended will have to take a lot of hits to be taken out. If that tank is defended by EW or a counter-UAS system or adequate anti-aircraft system or anti-drone system, then such drone attacks against land-based targets are going to become more and more difficult. So yes, I agree with all of the above. It is essentially the sword versus shield debate. And as each time the sword becomes sharper, more competent, the shield will also become more and more comparable and adequate.
Thank you. And I would love to jump off of that and ask Whitney, maybe you could talk a bit about exactly how electronic warfare can be used to defend tanks as well as ground troops.
So I think in one way, when we're talking about electronic warfare, of course, you could employ the type of electronic warfare counter-UAS systems that I mentioned earlier to either target aerial systems that are tracking your movements or trying to target you. But you also could use a broader tool set, which is electromagnetic spectrum operations, and part of that is try to manipulate the intelligence that your adversary is collecting on you to confuse their operational picture. I think the era of being able to hide your forces is largely over. I mean, because as we're discussing, you have so many small and affordable multispectral sensors that can now be put on, inexpensive drones. What you can do, however, is make it more difficult for your enemy to feel confident in the operational picture it's building of your troops and your movements. If you're one monolithic force, you're going to be very easy to track, and so are your electronic, infrared, and thermal footprints are going to be very easy to see. So instead of trying to be completely invisible, you want to lower some of your emissions in some part of your whether that be through camouflage, through dazzling, or you want to employ multispectral decoys, infrared, visual, electronic, to deceive enemy sensors, to use jammers to suppress radars. So the adversary is going to have a much more difficult time figuring out which one of these targets is real and which one is a decoy, which one of these targets is high valued and which is not. And of course, the more distributed your forces and decoys are, the more time it's going to take for them to figure this out as well. Again, you're never going to completely be able to hide or be invisible, but you are reducing the certainty the adversary has on your movements, which will force them to use more time and resources to figure that out. And at the end, if they still do want to target you kinetically, they're going to have to expend many, many more weapons to target all the growing number of targets that you're now presenting to them and you're now confusing them with. So you're making their life a lot more difficult. So that's how you can sort of manipulate electromagnetic energy in your forces to sort of confuse the operational picture that someone trying to track you would be building.
Absolutely.
It's actually really interesting that you say decoy, because I very much agree that I think we're going to see much more use of decoys now, which in a way is history really coming full circle, because that's where drones originally came from, right? As they were used as decoys in many circumstances. So that's kind of an interesting, history coming back here.
Bob, please come in, but just quickly, I was also wondering if you could touch on the difficulties of applying these strategies given the terrain.
Okay, we have a whole other discussion about the definition of the word strategy, but I completely agree with everything that Whitney just said. Now the difficulty of applying them, again, I go to the cost benefit analysis, and as has been said about American justice, it grinds slowly but fine. So too does the US military. We don't learn really fast. As a matter of fact, we often suck at learning fast. But eventually we do. And market forces often drive us to learning. And so Whitney's points about the countermeasures that are possible, that are developable, that you can, because there's a whole, a spectrum, not just the electromagnetic spectrum, but kinetic and all sorts of other things that can be cheaper. And this goes back to my point about drones, that it may become, oh God, I hate the Air Force with its F-22 and F-35 and the way they've driven the cost up. But they are the demonstrating point that cheaper munitions will drive the cost of drones higher and make them unaffordable and make them not useful unless they have all of these countermeasures, because it's too easy to shoot them down or negate them. You don't have to necessarily shoot them down. You can just negate them through, as Whitney pointed out, electromagnetic elements or other things. So that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Sam and then Enrique, please jump in.
So you raised the question of terrain, and that is a very difficult question, because right now the Azerbaijani forces have taken sort of low-lying areas, while Armenians are actually capable of holding the higher ground, especially in a very difficult mountainous terrain. We know that, for example, Armenian and Russian UAV operators specifically trained to operate their UAVs in the mountains. Well, mostly Russians trained to operate their UAVs in the mountains with high wind conditions and poor visibility. So clearly, many major military forces are looking at future drone use, not just sort of in very permissive environments, such as the skies over the Middle East, but also in other environments as well. Kind of taking this conflict back to Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think the situation would have been very different if Azeri forces also faced Armenian loitering munitions, Armenian combat UAVs, Armenian ISR UAVs, flying informations, and kind of forming the reconnaissance fire, reconnaissance strike loop for the Armenian forces. As Ulrike and Whitney and Bob have pointed out, this is a unique conflict because right now it is relatively one-sided in favor of Azerbaijan that fields the most UAVs and most drones. This would be very different if Armenia tried to match Azerbaijan with an equal number of diverse drones. So again, this is a unique sort of conflict, and it is a unique at this point in time. But now the real hard fighting begins because as the Azerbaijanis will try to take, or will attempt to take, mountains and high positions, the fighting may actually shift in Armenia's favor.
Yeah, and it is a incredibly difficult terrain. I believe that the U.S. military actually uses the region as an example in classroom training scenarios, just because of the difficulty of it. So I think that's an excellent point. Thank you. Ulrike, would you like to jump in?
We also
Yeah.
use Kentucky.
Yes.
I just wanted to kind of briefly disagree to some extent with the point, Analyst, that Bob made about drone defenses becoming necessarily cheaper. I mean, they will, and they are, and I agree, because we also start from a very high level. I mean, we've had situations where in order to fight one drone, you know, airspaces of whole countries were shut down, and, you know, several F-16s were brought in the air, and they shot, you know, 1 million missiles at drones that cost like $1,000. So of course, like that's not, you know, where we headed and what a good idea is. But I think it was Sam who mentioned the point about, you know, shield versus sword. We will see, and we are already seeing, this kind of circle or cycle of, you know, one system comes along, there's a counter system, and then the system gets better. And one way that drones are getting better in a way is through swarming, right? I mean, one of the big areas of research at the moment is AI-enabled swarming capability. And one of the reasons why so many countries are that interested in swarming is exactly because it allows you to overwhelm enemy air defenses. Now, again, you know, the defenses will adapt to that, and especially when it comes to kind of electronic warfare, I think that's kind of the ticket to counter swarms as well. But yeah, I think we're gonna have a few cycles here, and it's always the question, you know, at what point of the cycle are you entering in a conflict, and so we're gonna go a few rounds here. So I may not put quite so much of my money on countering drones as I understood Bob may.
Please jump in, Bob.
Well, yes, actually, one of the things I was thinking about is exactly that. Is that UAVs can be countered by swarms, and therefore swarms can be countered by swarms with progressively smaller UAVs, because it only takes a very tiny UAV to ram into a larger UAV to take out that UAV. And so then it becomes an economic competition, as I was saying before. If you look at, I'm going to keep going back to what we military historians call the Fortress Revolution as a foundation. There are between 8 and 15 what military historians call military revolutions. It depends upon your favorite historian, but one of them was called the Fortress Revolution. It started off with Charles VIII, But what it led to was the kind of star-shaped fortification that we see around Lille in France, designed by Vauban, or that we see in Baltimore, just a few miles north of here. I'm in Annapolis. Fort McHenry, you know, these star-shaped fortifications, an evolution of what a fortress looked like. And, you know, it went back and forth over time, but go back, if somebody wants to Google it, Google the design of the fortress at Nettuno, which was one of the first transitional fortresses that kind of combined what people had learned after Charles VIII went smashing through northern Italy, you know, and trying to figure out how to use cannon, how to use walls and stuff like that and integrate it and do it at a lower cost. Ultimately, it was a greater cost. But the drones, it seems to me, they either have to go stealth, which is expensive, or they have to swarm, which can be countered by cheaper swarms. That's my observation. I could be wrong. I'm done.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Sam. I want to look slightly outside the region, and I was wondering if you could give us some input on the different countries and industries that are driving this conflict. So as we've mentioned, there has been Israeli drones used in the conflict. There have been Turkish drones used in the conflict, potentially some of them being flown by the Turkish military. And at the same time, I believe Azerbaijan has a in-country license from the Israeli aeronautics group that allows them to manufacture some drones in-house. So I was wondering if you could talk about those dynamics of these foreign industries contributing so heavily to this conflict.
So I think at this point, any military of consequence or any military that's preparing to fight a war of any kind, or even country security force or internal security force, is looking at drones and UAVs as mission multipliers. And because we have so many exporters now, because we have so many countries developing these systems, it is becoming possible even for a smaller nation to either acquire such systems in whole, acquire a license to assemble them, or to launch its own domestic defense, a domestic drone industry. And Azerbaijan is one such country in the former Soviet space. I think of the 15 or so former Soviet republics, something like 12 are now actually featuring their own domestic production or drone forces that were acquired with the help of, for example, American, Israeli, Chinese, or European manufacturers, or even Iranian manufacturers for that matter. So there's been an emergence of new players, if you will, over the past decade in drone manufacturing and export. These are China, Turkey, and Iran that have very quickly caught up to the drone leaders, such as such as United States and Israel. Other major militaries around the world, like Russia, are also fast-tracking their UAV developments. Multiple UAV models are now in different stages of testing and acquisition. And of course, the question is, if Russia, for example, had loitering munitions on combat UAVs for export, would they ship those to Armenia prior to this conflict? Would Armenia actually acquire it from Russia? And the answer is probably yes. Again, we don't know exactly how the Armenian Defense Ministry has prioritized its military acquisition, but Azerbaijan essentially put a lot of emphasis on diversifying their combat force. And because they're willing exporters around the world, again, it is possible to acquire a different type of drone for a different type of mission. We're probably going to see such drone use proliferate. We're probably going to see more countries acquiring intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones, quadricopters like Kargu for loitering missions. We're probably going to see more countries start trying to offer their drones for export to an ever rising and willing number of importers. And we actually saw that start out really in 2008, when smaller Georgia used its UAVs against a much larger, although less sophisticated than today, Russian military. And there's even a famous video of a Georgian UAV filming itself getting shot down by a Russian fighter jet. So clearly the writing was already on the wall a long time ago. And the question is, how prepared are nations today and in the future for this type of war?
Thank you. And I will take this time to plug the CNA Artificial Intelligence in Russia newsletter. It is a very useful resource if you want to find out the newest in Russian artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. Thank you, Sam. I'd like to turn to Enrique, and I would love to have you speak about the fact that coverage of this conflict has been driven a lot by the question of tanks and drones and the importance of drones. But this isn't the first time that we've seen drones used this way in a conflict. It's been well established that there has been this source of drone use in Libya and Syria. So I'm curious if you think there's something new here, if there's a reason that this is being discussed more.
Yeah, definitely. So first, because I think it's really important what Sam just said about drone proliferation, I would also say that at this point, we have reached a point where every actor who wants drone capabilities can get them. Now, again, drone capabilities is a big term, and I'm not saying everyone can get a Reaper drone, but even non-state actors, if they want to, if they have a little bit of funding, a little bit of competencies, you can get pretty sophisticated systems. And that's just the world we live in, and something we will have to deal with. So all this discussion that we still have, actually, especially in Europe and especially in Germany, about limiting drone proliferation and leading by example and all of that, I think that ship has sailed, but many years ago. Why are or what's interesting about drones in this conflict, or why are we looking at this in particular, even though we have seen drones elsewhere before? I would emphasize 3 points really. First, the propaganda. That really, I mentioned this before, but just the fact, especially Azerbaijan, but also Armenia has been really good at using Twitter, YouTube, all kinds of social media challenges with these clips, many of which were taken by drone. And that just, has really focused interest from all over the world, kind of realizing, oh, this is a thing. So number one, propaganda. The second element, why we're so interested in the drones in this conflict is, I think, because again, we have here two real states with real armed forces fighting against each other, and drones play such a big role. And I think that there was a bit of a thinking in the expert community that drones wouldn't play a very big role in interstate conflict, state against state conflict, because of all the things we just said. They're vulnerable, you can shoot them down, etc. So in this hypothetical war between the US and China, we don't think that drones will really be the decisive thing. And here we have a conflict between two states, and drones really matter. And I think that's kind of worth acknowledging. And we've talked about why that is and all of that. But I think this is why we are talking about this, because so far we've thought about drones quite often in a context of one state against non-state actors, or at least a state operating in a territory where they had aerial dominance, aerial superiority. That's not the case here, and so that's why there's a lot of interest. And then the third point why I think there's quite a bit of interest, including from the expert community, is the loitering munition element, because we've been so drones have been on the battlefield for quite a long time. Loitering munition, but of Israeli systems that the Azerbaijanis have been using, not so much. We haven't seen them in use so much. And they are also really controversial, right? So loitering munitions are always the first thing that people mention when they talk about autonomous weapon systems and autonomy in warfare. And seeing loitering munition being used in this conflict, I think has attracted quite a bit of interest as well. It's worth noting that Azerbaijan had used Herat loitering munition already in, I think it was 2016, when it used it against a bus full of Armenian soldiers. So we already had this kind of one instance, but here we have them used in a war, and so that has attracted quite rightly, I think, quite a bit of attention.
Thank you so much. Whitney, please.
I think one thing that's important to know is there's been a lot of talk and conversation about capabilities from a UAS, counter-UAS tanks point of view, but I also think that training and real-world experimentation is just as valuable. And while I wouldn't say we're in some kind of new stage of war, I would say, many strategists have been describing this coming stage for years, right? Less ability to hide, smaller, cheaper assets like drones, more information-based competitions, and only a few select number of militaries are currently getting that type of experience. And to Sam's point, right, Russia is getting that experience in multiple theaters and on multiple terrains. That's invaluable, which is why I think it's so important for Western forces to take note. With Western forces, especially the US, I worry less about our ability to procure the right capabilities and more, although that could be an issue, but I worry more about how we're going to train for these sorts of operations, which looks really differently to how we're currently training our forces. So there's a big leap between procuring the right sort of counter-UAS system and then being able to integrate that into combined arms warfare against a near peer. So I just thought that was worth mentioning.
That's fantastic, Whitney. Thank you so much. Sam, do you want to jump in quickly?
Yeah, I want to second Whitney's point about training. So obviously this conflict is going to be watched very closely and will be studied very closely. Again, kind of bringing Russia into the equation. Russians have been training very extensively on counter-UAS and electronic warfare systems and technologies. In fact, they're training around the clock. They're using such systems in different drills and exercises. Counter-UAS training is now kind of pushed down to every major tactical level across the Russian armed forces. Russian officers are also taught how to use and shoot down UAVs, as well as how to utilize and work together with electronic warfare detachments. So for some militaries like Russia, counter-UAS and electronic warfare, which can counter drones rather successfully, is becoming a must, and is becoming an absolutely essential part of training going forward. As Whitney said, that's probably not the case for other militaries, but for a country like Russia that is looking at what's happening to its south, the counter-UAS systems and electronic warfare component is going to become very important going forward. And Russians, as well as other militaries, are going to look at how loitering munitions are used in this conflict as well. As Ulrike said, this is something relatively new. It is new not just for the major militaries, but it is probably new for many countries looking to augment their capabilities with something that will probably become relatively cheap, given a larger number of exporters of this technology.
Wonderful, thank you. And that's actually great. Whitney and Sam, you have pretty much answered what was going to be my last question. So I will now turn to Bob. What do you think is the single big takeaway that you would want the US military to have looking at this conflict unfolding?
When I was teaching at West Point, usually around lesson 2 or 3, I would hammer home this point to the cadets. Now they're looking at me as an airborne infantry ranger and like, hey, he's gonna say something, about jumping, and no. Tactics wins battles. Logistics wins wars. And that is where we are. The logistics of UAVs and armor vehicles is the issue. It's not whether this UAV or that UAV can be shot down or can kill a tank. It's how cheaply you can produce the systems that change the equation. That's what made me an infantryman instead of a tanker, because I was afraid, based upon what the reporting in the professional journals was in the late 1980s. I thought, oh, screw it. If push comes to shove, I want to dig into dirt. Buddies of mine became tankers, Tanks did not disappear in 1989, despite the technology that was supposed to be coming out and that had come out. It comes down to logistics.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful point. And then just to finish it up, Ulrike, what do you think is the main takeaway that European militaries should have while watching this conflict?
That is a hard question. I mean, I would, to be honest, I would emphasize the point that this isn't over yet, right? So I think it would actually be really dangerous to just say like, oh, now this is the big lesson, because just because this is working at the moment for Azerbaijan, it can also turn again. So I'd be careful. But yeah, I think one important lesson is basically what we said earlier, namely that drones will be an element, already are an important element in today's and future conflicts, and we need to be prepared for that, and we need to think through counter-drone systems more. And this is a big challenge. I don't have an answer for this, and we see this all over the world, and also in Europe. We have a lot of different systems that are being tested and fielded and all of that and being developed. And I think this work needs to continue. So, but yeah, there's a lot of work to be done for people such as ourselves and for people in the military.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful way to end this discussion. So thank you so much to the audience for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. It has been absolutely wonderful to have you here. I highly encourage that the audience checks out each and every one of you. They have great Twitter profiles. They are working on some fantastic work, and they are all experts that we should be listening to in the years to come. So thank you for joining us, and I hope that everyone has a nice day.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.